you ever thought your voice doesn't matter? Thanks for joining me today on the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and today we're going to have a conversation with my new friend, Danielle Kelly. She is a joy to talk with, and we're going to hear about how using her own voice that she was able to better understand her own parable story.
I think that for a lot of us, we go to the Bible and we're like, let me go find out about myself. I'm going through this issue, so let me find me. And then when you're looking for me, if you're falling short, for me, I would hear God's voice like more of a condemnation.
Here's my conversation with Danielle Kelly. Danielle Kelly, welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm so excited to be able to chat with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Danielle, for having me. I'm just so excited that we get to have this conversation because the first time we met, I was like, we are kindred spirits.
We are. I did want to bring that up because I remember I was getting my coffee and I heard somebody say, Danielle, not to say that that's a complete unique name, but
right.
I don't hear it all the time. So I turn and I'm like, oh, I don't know that person. And they were talking to you. And so I'm like, oh, your name is Danielle? What do you do? And basically, we are the same person. So
we are. We might just look a little different on the outside, but we are the same.
Yeah. So because you are a podcaster, you've been a part of ministry, you love the local church, women's ministry. I was just like, how have we not met each other? It's a doppelganger. I'd love to know for you, Danielle, like, have you had Jesus in your life for a long time since you're in ministry, or is that something new for you?
Well, I became a believer when I was 16. Mm-hmm. I didn't grow up in a Christian household. The weird thing is like we always believed that Jesus was there. Like we knew God existed. That was not a debate in our house. But having a deep personal relationship with him, recognizing the need for repentance and confession and holiness and sanctification, no.
Yeah.
And that didn't come until I was 16. And it came really because the Lord used my father who had abandoned me. He left me when I was in the second grade and he decided to resurface on Christmas Eve to surprise me. And it was not a good thing. And I just had a lot of suppressed anger that came to the surface and frustration. So anyway, my mom was simultaneously going to church at the same time. And I heard the gospel for the first time, really understanding that I wasn't a good girl by world standards, that I was a sinner in need of salvation, but also that Jesus loved me and that he had a plan for my life and that I wasn't a mistake. And I love Psalm 139 because when you're dealing with abandonment in your life, it can feel like, well, what's the purpose of my life? And why was I not good enough for my dad to be there? But then reading Psalm 139 for the first time was like, no, I was not a mistake. And God knew me even before I was formed in my mother's womb. So that's when I became a Christian and I'm 37.
It is so interesting how that story, as we read through the Bible, that relationship between us and the Father, we see that in, different biblical stories and how I see that playing out in different people's life. Like I was just talking with a guy and even it was like his adoptive father. And it was an example that was happening in his own life. Like just to see how God uses so many things to continue to draw us back to him. So yes. I love that, Danielle. And I'm sure, gosh, like that's something I think for you is you're continually working on and figuring out that father relationship with your own dad, but also like your spiritual dad. Was that kind of like a barrier for you?
Oh,
just connecting with God in that way?
Big time. Yes. It's so interesting because it was the very thing that drew me to the Lord. But then God the Father, it took me so long to even want to address him in prayer. It was so easy for me to pray to Jesus and be like, Jesus, but like Abba Father. And then I remember that song when Good Father, when it came out. Ooh, I wrestled a lot with that of like, no, you're not a good father. And why did you let this happen to me? But the Lord has brought a lot of healing and reconciliation with my earthly father and just done an amazing work. That's a whole nother a whole podcast could be dedicated to what God has done in that. But I'm at a place in my life now where I'm like, no, God is my father. There's no one like him. And I'm able to separate what my earthly father did and recognize that like I was a gift to him and he chose not to steward me. And that's not my problem. Took me years to get to that place. But now I'm like, no, I'm secure in the Father, which has done a lot for my identity. in my Heavenly Father.
Yeah. I think, Danielle, that's so good that you said that. And I say this all the time, because I think when we hear like, oh, our relationship has been restored, that is a process for those 20 plus years. And even still that it is restored, there is sometimes that brings up certain like trigger points, or like, why am I still angry about this? Why am I still dealing with this? So that's helpful. How would you say, if somebody is kind of walking through that season of their life, what were some ways that allowed you to heal?
Practically, therapy,
Yeah.
number one, was like huge. I remember getting to a point where I was being triggered a lot. There was a man that discipled me, and he was like a second dad, and we started having issues, which kicked up a lot of stuff from my abandonment from my dad. I started to get stuck parenting and just seeing how my husband is showing up for his kids and just being like, why?
Yeah.
So I needed to get help. So that was one practical thing of just saying, I can't handle this on my own. I need outside help. And through therapy, my therapist has helped me work on being brutally honest with God. And I think that I was somewhat honest, but not really going deep into my emotions of how I felt abandoned by the Lord. And so that was one thing. Working on my identity, that was huge. And as a believer, for me, I think it's more understanding who God is, and that then transforms how I see myself. Yeah. And then scripture talks about being transformed in the renewing of your mind. So just kind of identifying what are the lies that you're believing about yourself, and what's the source, like who told you that, and digging into that. And you might need someone to help you through that process of identifying the lie and then identifying the truth and just working on renewing your mind. Yeah. I don't know if that was helpful. But
no, that is helpful, because I think what you just said, like having someone identify the source. I was just listening to something this morning. I don't know what it was, but it just triggered something in my mind. Sometimes we believe that lie so deeply in our heart. Like that's all we see. So we need an outside source to speak that truth into us and say, that does not even exist. Like, I don't even see that in your life. So you're right. Having an outside source is so helpful.
I think the other two things that I learned on my journey, it was learning how to use my voice, period. Because in the abandonment, no one ever talked to me about it. My mom, we didn't discuss it. So it took me a while to voice not only to God, this is how I feel, but also voice to my father. This is what you've done to me. Yeah. And you're going to listen in a very polite way. And let's have this conversation. We don't need to yell. This may make you feel uncomfortable, but I'm valuable enough to tell you what you've done. The other thing that I would encourage people is to recognize that forgiveness is such a long journey. And there's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. You can totally forgive somebody and not be in relationship with them, but reconciliation, in my opinion, requires both people's willingness to work on it. So even with my journey with my father, I started forgiveness a long time ago, early in my Christian walk, but true reconciliation didn't happen until many years later when he was willing to enter that and own some things. So then it was like, okay, now there's a level of our relationship that I can enter into. But if you're not going to own it and it becomes more abusive, and toxic for me, then I'll forgive you. But then here's the boundary in this relationship.
Gosh, Danielle, we didn't even get into the parable yet.
Maybe this is the parable. I'm like,
I'm just like, who is this? We didn't even say what you do. So Danielle, Danielle, you are a writer, podcaster, a life coach, and speaker, just all the things. Like, what drives you? What is your passion, to do all of those things? Like, why that?
I think for me, the drive is just, I want women to be free so badly. I want them to experience fully who God is and who they are in God. That's so important to me. And another thing that drives me is, as a young Christian, it took me a while to really understand that I needed to align with God's purposes for my life. Because in our world, it's like, you dream, you go do, but sometimes it's not what God has called us to do. So I really, I'm passionate about helping women align with God's purposes for their lives, because that's going to keep us in the center of his will. We're all called to love him with our whole hearts and love others. But how that's going to be portrayed is different. And then just, I'm really passionate about people understanding what it means to abide and remain in Jesus and like run this Christian race strong. That is what drives me. And honestly, what is driving me in this particular season is because I've spent so much time hiding my gifts and pushing them aside. And I'm still young, but I'm like, man, I'm almost 40. I could die at any moment. But like, I don't want, it's the truth. Like, I'm not guaranteed 20 or 40 years, but it's just like, I don't want to end this life. And the Lord's like, yeah, I love you, but I entrusted some things to you and you wasted it. I just don't want that. But I also don't want to do it the world's way. I want to do it in the way that pleases and honors God.
That is hard. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about of like learning to like hear our voice. God wants us to use our voice and our gifts and to not hide that. I mean, that's so hard to do sometimes. Even like this world is very showy. You're like, oh, is that me?
Right.
So I think this really lends itself into your parable story today, Danielle. So what is your parable that you'd like to share with us?
Well, my parable is tied to the parable of talents, but last summer I was blessed to go to this secular online training, and it was really out of my comfort zone. It was 2 weekends of intenseness, of 10, 12-hour days online, very hands-on, even though it was online. And I went into it with the purpose of, I want to be more courageous. That was my goal. But going into it, I was really scared because most of my life is around Christians. I work from home. I'm a pastor's wife. I lead women's ministry. It's all evolved around church. So I'm not around people that don't know Jesus or don't follow him. So this was a space that I was entering in, and I felt this challenge of like, do I dim my light? I don't want to be one of those obnoxious Christians that are like being offensive, you know, but it's like, if you're going to meet Danielle, you're going to meet Jesus because we're one.
Yeah.
So I had this fear about being bold about Christ, being afraid of man. And what I mean by that is just like afraid of what people will think. Yeah. And through the process, I discovered, as much as I try to hide, people were drawn to me. And at some point in the training, I was like nominated the top leader. I was like, what is happening right now? Yeah. You know, I see other stronger leaders. I'm like, what is going on? Like, so I came out of that realizing like I'm a leader of leaders. And there was many people like me that were leader of leaders. Like I wasn't the number one top, but it was just like, there were a group of us that was like, okay, the group wants you to lead. And that shocked me because I can see it in the Christian environment, but I just wasn't expecting it in a secular environment. Yeah. So for me, coming out of that, it really, you know, I talked about my dad, why I hide and why like the parable of the talents where the master is given his servants these valuable talents. Yeah. Like I looked it up and a talent it was a hefty worth. It was equal to 20 years of wages. And like one of them received 5 of them. Like that's crazy. But just seeing how 2 of the 3 servants went and they reproduced. They invested, they made the most of this. But then there's that one servant who was like, I'm going to hide this thing. And when the master comes back to do an assessment, really, an evaluation, that servant's like, I was afraid. I knew you were a hard man. He just uses all these excuses. Yeah. And that has been me. I would love to say like, yeah, I was the person that got the 5 talents and invested, but no, most of my life I've hid it. And when I think about the parable of the talents, something that so sticks out to me is like the perception he had of the master. We don't know what the first 2, their perception was, but the perception didn't stop them from reproducing. Yeah. If that makes sense. Yeah. And then the perception of the man who had one talent, he says, I was afraid. That, like, I was afraid, like 3 words describes my life of how afraid I was of God, afraid I was of the talent that he gave me, the gifts and the abilities. So you asked me earlier, what drives me, even with writing, is something that I wrestled with God about for years, because he's called me to do it. And I'm like, but why? I don't feel equipped. And like, how am I going to make money off of this? And he's like, go do it because I've called you to do it. Go be like the salt and the light. Like, go do good works for me and point people to me. Don't make it about yourself. So the training really changed me. It really profoundly shifted my year. It shifts everything about my life, of how I show up, where now it's like, no, I have to do these things, not because God is a demanding, angry God. No, he's given me a gift that only I can do, and it'll point people to him. Like, what a beautiful thing to be entrusted with a gift that points people directly to God, which helps, like we talked about. I think you kind of mentioned, like, how do you do these things in the world is so showy, but it helps to make it not narcissistic. When you stop pointing people to you and point them straight to God.
I feel that, Danielle. I feel all of those feelings, the scared, wondering like, oh gosh, like, is this worth it? Should I be doing this? That is the struggle. Why do you think those excuses keep coming up? Is it something that was the devil? Is it something that, over time, like, we've just like built this cage around ourselves? Why do you think that is for you?
I think for me, it's a combination of the devil is definitely a huge, he's the accuser and doesn't want us to succeed. But I think for me, when I think back on my story, a lot of it's tied to my dad abandoning me and a feeling unworthy, and growing up and never feeling like a leader. Always, I never wanted to be that person that was like out in the front. But in my mind, when something was going down, like, the leadership in me was processing, but I was too scared to speak up. And when I look back, I'm like, there's always those times where my leadership was being acknowledged and I was dealing with imposter syndrome. Like, I remember in middle school, I don't know if y'all had DARE on the middle,
I did.
the Middle West, the Midwest. I'm not a Midwest native, but
that's all right.
Yeah, on the East Coast. So like, I remember being in middle school and being approached like, can you be a DARE advocate? Like, and having those opportunities. And high school, also a group of people, we were voted most likely to succeed, and being like, well, why would they pick me? It's imposter syndrome. Like, no, it's a mistake. Someone else is better. And I think the other thing that has caused me from really shining is I did struggle through college, and that kind of did something to my identity as well. So it's just really a lack of, I don't know if it's self-worth or just, it's a worth issue. Of, I don't feel worthy. It's Gideon, mighty man of valor. And he's like, not me. It's Moses, where he's like, go speak. And he's like, I can't speak.
I think that's true, Danielle. It's like God has created us with natural abilities, something that it almost seems mundane to us. And I remember having a conversation, and I'm just like talking about stuff that just seems totally normal to me. And they're like, whoa, I just need a second. Like, that was so good. I'm like, really?
Really?
Like,
right?
Are you sure? I was just so shocked, because I think it just becomes natural for us. So it doesn't seem like anything special, out of the ordinary. So it just becomes normal over the course of our life. So I get that. I think that that's easy for us to fall into that trap and just believe like, oh yeah, like, doesn't everyone do this? Or why would anyone ask me to be a DARE leader?
Right. Like, right? My like little 12-year-old, however old I was like, what in the world?
Yeah. I also like what you said about the perception of the master. I think there's so many times when we read the Bible, like, we hear a certain tone in our head, or we imagine Jesus saying something in a certain way. I just remember reading that somewhere where, like, when Jesus is walking on the water, and you're hearing him like, well, why did you not believe? Or why didn't you do that? And another person's like, oh, I didn't hear that at all. Just kind of like, hey, why didn't you believe? So I think that really plays a role of, when we're reading our Bible, when we're listening to the thoughts inside of our head, what is the actual perception and the tone that's coming across? Have you found that to be true for you?
Oh my gosh, yes. Like for a long time. You used that example. I don't know if you watched The Chosen.
Yeah.
For anybody that hasn't watched it, sorry. Spoiler alert, that last episode where they portrayed that exact scene and Jesus he was not like, Peter, why did, it was just like, you have little faith, like just the gentleness of God. So for me, the shift was spending more time and shifting when I think that for a lot of us, we go to the Bible and we're like, let me go find out about myself.
Yes.
I'm going through this issue, so let me find me. And then when you're looking for me, if you're falling short, for me, I would hear God's voice like more of a condemnation. Mm-hmm. But when you look from the perspective of even the parable of the talents and just like, okay, let's see God in this, where the servant's like, well, you're hard. Dude, he gave you his own money to entrust. Like, it's not yours.
Yeah.
And even that is like, actually is being really generous to you to give you this talent and to entrust it to you and leave for a long time. Like, that's generous. Mm-hmm. That's not harsh.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of trust. So yeah, when you look at a story in the Bible and say, okay, God, where do I see you first? Mm-hmm. You end up seeing so much more that we miss when we go to like me.
Nobody really explained like how to use the Bible to me when I was younger. And there's that back. I don't know if that's a concordance or it was a topical guide. Mm-hmm. I would just be like, okay, whatever. And then I would go to it. And you're right. It's so easy for us to be like, this is what I'm dealing with, rather than how can you help me first? Mm-hmm. Or how can I like honor you and seek you first? And even that Chosen, I think a lot of us are so different in how we learn, how we perceive things. So when I saw Jesus the first time, and I know that was not Jesus. I get that.
Right.
It's Jesus. I just think it was so beautiful for me to like physically see and imagine like what it would somewhat be like, just to have a little bit more framework. That really gave me a lot of comfort. I loved it. And I think finding tools like that, whether it's The Chosen or something else, to help us better understand the Bible and building our relationship, so helpful. Yeah.
And you know what, Danielle, too, it's like we're not explaining that this is a love letter to us.
Yes.
From God. Mm-hmm. It's him being like, love me and pursue me. And here's all the ways that you'll get to know me and understand me and live with me. Mm-hmm. We're just not explaining that. But even that perception is like, how many of us go, oh, this is our love letter? Yeah. No, a lot of us are like, this is a book full of rules and things I can't do. That's a different vibe than this is God's heart for me. This is his heart of love.
Danielle, you and your husband pastor Chicago West Bible Church. And what's it like to be pastors? First of all, we're dealing with our own, like figuring our relationship out. It's growing or changing. But then now you have the opportunity to lead people. And sometimes, whether you want it or not, people put you on a platform.
Oh my gosh, yes.
They think that like, oh, well, you got all your stuff together in life. And then,
and I'm like, no,
just
I
a heads
don't.
up, we don't. Okay. So what's it been like for you to step into a role of a pastor?
Well, for me, I don't necessarily have that particular role at our church. My husband, he holds that title, which is fine for me. Totally, like, I'm totally okay. But I think that there's definitely elements of that shepherding gift that comes out of me. Obviously, leading the women's ministry and just supporting my husband in that role. But for what it's been like is, number one, I never realized how much I dealt with fear of man and what people thought of me until we started the church. Mm-hmm. Before that, if you were like, do you care about this person's opinion? I'd be like, girl, no. And then I was like, oh, snaps, I really do care. So I had to learn how not to perform for man.
Yeah.
And just to learn how to show up as myself and buck against people's expectations for me.
Mm-hmm.
Our church is multi-generational, multicultural.
Mm-hmm.
So that has been really fascinating to come alongside of all those different groups of people and encourage them to love one another and help, especially because I'm younger, like I'm 37, like sometimes it can be a little intimidating of how do you disciple somebody that's 80? Because you feel like they need to be discipling me. But the truth is there are some people that need our discipleship.
Totally.
And so that has been interesting to embrace that.
What would you say has been, another challenge for you? Because you have the fear that you've already talked about. How do you walk alongside your church? And also for me, like I just kind of ended, our women's ministry is not gone, but after 12 years, I kind of passed the baton and it feels so good. But there is always throughout that, there has like been like a sense of guilt. Like, am I doing enough? Am I helping enough? Again, it goes back to me and like this wanting to fix and help because I desire for people like you want to be free. I want people to have a relationship with God so desperately. Yeah. So is there a similar challenge for you of like, I want to give myself, but also I don't want to burn myself out at the same time. And it isn't just about Danielle, you know?
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think what's challenging right now in this season, because I lead women's ministry too, is just so many people have these heavy needs, heavy trauma. Yeah. That's the challenging thing too of we're not trained therapists. Like my husband's like, I went to school for theology. Yeah. I did not go to school for psychology. So I feel that tension of how do you walk with people going through deep trauma, especially we have so many people that have tons of church hurt. Mm-hmm. And the challenge of walking alongside of them and them not trusting you because of past church leadership is very difficult. It's almost, I don't want to use the analogy of a punching bag, but sometimes it almost feels like you got to take a lot of punches from people because in their pain, they're hurting and they can lash out and do things. And like this is out of pain. I can't personalize that, but that's hard when you're in a position of leadership and that's coming from multiple people. Or they, like I said, they just have a lot of trauma and sometimes they can feel a little helpless because I'm like you, I want to fix it all and I can't. But what I've recently come to realize through a Bible study on worry and anxiety and surrender, it's not my role to fix these people. I am not their good shepherd. I'm not. Yeah. They have one good shepherd, and that's Jesus. And being okay with pointing people to the Lord, but also being like, I'm here with you in it. And I don't have the necessarily final solution to it. But one of the steps that I do have is just maybe to be with you in the pain or to pray with you, to walk alongside of you. But I don't need to have the full solution. And that has been a challenge to accept, but it's freeing because it's like, okay.
Danielle, I did want to encourage you too. I had talked with Taylor Warburton. She was at a previous event and she had told me like she just felt like God wanted like to ask you for prayer like through the whole time. Like I have to talk to this. She's like, I don't know why, but I just have to talk to this lady. And so there was a moment that you did like pray over her. And again, you never encountered each other and you just like spoke everything that she had already like written down over her. And she's just like, wow. So, sometimes when you say about like using your voice, like, should I be like the full Danielle? Like you did in that moment and it was good. And like she got home and she's like, what is God going to continue to do? And now she's pregnant. Like, just like,
I think I remember praying with her. Was it when we had like the big prayer together?
Yeah, right at the end.
Yes. I looked at her. I was like, okay, Lord, I don't know what her story is, but I'm going to just lay my hand on her and start praying.
Oh gosh.
Awesome.
It's so fun to like feel those connections because again, there's so many things in your life, in my life, and for those listening, we don't even know like how that is like changing. And I hope that one day when we are in heaven, God's just like, hey, I got this reel for you to watch like over and over just to see, because we don't even know the magnitude of how you've been used in this world. So
wow, that's so encouraging. And that reminds me of the parable of the talents, because it's like, I know that God has gifted me as an intercessor, but I'm at a place of surrender where all I know is I need to pray for people. And I trust that when I put my hands on somebody or draw them close, even if I don't know them, I know, okay, Holy Spirit, you're going to guide these words. Thank you for sharing that, Danielle, because that's confirmation and encourages me to keep doing it. Because I feel like when we're gifted in something, we think that we need to have it all together. It's like, no.
Yeah. And it is, you're right. And I think that's so important, is continually encouraging people. Like when something happens and I feel that nudge of like, should I tell somebody? Yeah, you should, because it just pushes people along. And especially in ministry, even in our jobs, in our marriages and our relationships, we're like, are we doing this? Right. Is this right? So yeah, that's huge for me, of just like every time I'm feeling those nudges lately, I'm like, just say it. Like, what are they going to say? Like, how dare you? Stop encouraging me. So, okay. Well, Danielle, one last question. Tell me a little bit about your podcast, Unashamed and Free. Like, what was the heart? And I think I heard of it already, but like, what was your desire for launching that?
So it came out of my own personal journey with shame tied to my dad. And just feeling, I mentioned earlier how I was in a difficult time with processing my dad's abandonment. And at the same time, we were planting the church. And what I was finding is, as I was sharing what I was struggling with, I would be met with compassion from some people. And then others would judge me and be like, oh no, you're a pastor's wife. You're in leadership. You shouldn't be, you shouldn't, should. Yeah. All those like condemning things. And it was frustrating me because I'm like, I don't care that I'm a pastor's wife. I'm a Christian. And am I not the only Christian that's experiencing shame? So I got to the point where I was just like, which is crazy when I think about it, because normally when you're dealing with shame, you don't want to bring it to the light. But it was like, I want to have this conversation. Can we just talk? Because I cannot be the only one out here struggling out here in these streets. Yeah. And I'm not. I think the first episode was about my dad. It's so crazy. Like I cringe because I still don't know what I'm doing, but it doesn't matter because so many people have been transformed and blessed by me showing up imperfectly on that. So that's what really drove it. And I love stories. I think everybody's story matters. And I want to give a space for people who may have never told their story the chance to tell their journey out of shame into freedom, because in the telling is part of the healing. That's a release in that. So that's the driving force behind it.
So good, Danielle. Well, we will have everything in the show notes of how you can connect to Danielle and her podcast and her Instagram. But Danielle, this was a joy. I had so much fun with you today. Thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you for having me. And you're doing a fantabulous job. So keep moving forward, even through hardships and difficulties. Do not give up.
All right. Thank you, Danielle. What wisdom Danielle brought to the conversation today. I am grateful to get to know her a little bit better and to see how those natural God-given abilities are coming out in her story and how he is using them in her life. To connect with Danielle, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for all of her details. And every week we do some reflection questions to refer back to our conversation. So number 1, how are you learning how to use your voice to yourself, to others, and possibly to God? Number 2, how have you been hiding your gifts lately? Maybe you're in a season where you feel, like you are questioning, you have fear or worry, you fill in the blank. How have you been hiding those gifts that God so desperately wants you to be able to use? Thank you so much for supporting the Parable Podcast. One easy way to support us is subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast, on Apple, Spotify, or even on YouTube. And thank you so much to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for editing this podcast. That is going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how your voice matters. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.